the biosynthesis. I will start by serotonin. So I have already mentioned this. Tryptophan can enter using a specific amino acid, aromatic amino acid transporter. So tryptophan can enter in the cytosol of serotonin cells, where there is tryptophan hydroxylase giving 5-hydroxytryptophan. So this enzyme is the main enzyme in the biosynthesis of serotonin. It characterizes the serotonin neurons in the brain, and you can find it also in periphery. Is it the same? No. In periphery, you have TPH1, and in the brain, in serotonin neurons, you have TPH2. So TPH2 is more efficacious compared to TPH1, even if the two enzymes differ. I don't exactly remember, but I think this is ridiculous. Something like 1 amino acid. And despite this, it dramatically lower the activity of TPH1 compared to TPH2. So this is quite weird. So TPH2 does not work like tyrosine hydroxylase, so I put from the law of Le Chatelier, which stipulates that the end of your metabolic network, here serotonin, so the end of metabolic network go back and inhibit the main enzyme. So that's the reason I put red, the minus in red. In case of serotonin, we can discuss because this is not really true. In fact, TPH2 could have sort of constitutive way of functioning, so you give tryptophan whatever is going on, it will produce 5-hydroxytryptophan. So this is less regulated compared to other enzymes. And we have some specific inhibitors, including PCPA, which is parachlorophenylalanine. It has been characterized in 1966. So once 5-hydroxytryptophan is produced, it is decarboxylazed by L-aromatic amino acid decarboxylase, which is not specific of serotonin cells. And we have a lot of inhibitors, benzerazide, carbidopa, and NSD-1015. And I will speak about those inhibitors because they are not used, in fact, in the to target usually the synthesis of serotonin. Biosynthesis of dopamine. Tyrosine is entering, so this is the main precursor. Tyrosine is entering the cytosol of cells through aromatic amino acid transporter. Then tyrosine in the cytosol is hydroxylated by tyrosine hydroxylase. So this is an additional hydroxyl on tyrosine. And in that case, tyrosine hydroxylase, for which I know one subtype, but tyrosine hydroxylase is strongly regulated with different cofactors, etc., etc. And in that case, dopamine in the cytosol, depending on its concentration, but if it's raised, dopamine can inhibit the production of tyrosine, of L-DOPA by inhibiting tyrosine hydroxylase. So, tyrosine hydroxylase can be inhibited by alpha-methyl paratyrosine, which is not really used in clinic, more in preclinic research. So, it is administered something like 100 milligram per kilogram or 200 milligram per kilogram, and you can expect a decrease in dopamine by something like 80 to 90% of dopamine tissue content. Then, L-DOPA in the cytosol is decarboxylated by the same enzyme that we saw before, the L-aromatic amino acid decarboxylase. So it is also, of course, I give you the same inhibitors, benzerazide, carbidopa, and benzerazide and carbidopa are included in the treatment of Parkinson's disease with L-DOPA. So fasten your seat belt and please understand what I will tell you. You understand that L-DOPA can be decarboxylated by several systems, and if the Parkinson patient take a pills of L-DOPA, L-DOPA will be decarboxylated in periphery beyond reaching the brain. Of course, you have also a lot of decarboxylase in periphery. Not only in monoaminergic systems. So, in the treatment of Parkinson's disease, you give L-DOPA, which is exogenous, plus benzerazide and carbidopa, with the original aim to enhance the production of dopamine. And then you should tell me, but this is completely stupid because we impair with benzerazide and carbidopa the transformation of L-DOPA into dopamine. So your therapeutic strategy is stupid. Yes, it is, except if benzerazide and carbidopa do not cross the blood-brain barrier. And that is the situation. So, you give exogenous L-DOPA, a pill, which contains benzerazide and carbidopa, then peripherally benzerazide and carbidopa block decarboxylase so that L-DOPA is not degraded into dopamine in periphery, so that the concentration of L-DOPA in the blood are maintained, and so that the entry of L-DOPA in the brain is dramatically ameliorated. So, benzerazide and carbidopa are interesting, because they do not cross the blood-brain barrier and avoid the destruction of your medication in periphery. So L-DOPA can go in the brain with a higher efficacy. And the biosynthesis of noradrenaline, this is almost the same as dopamine, because you need the production of dopamine in the cytosol. Then noradrenergic neurons express another enzyme, which is dopamine beta hydroxylase. So, by the way, be aware that each time you are using benzerazide, carbidopa, alpha-methylparatyrosine, etc., etc., you can also alter the function of noradrenergic neurons. Of course, they share the same biosynthesis way in the beginning. Then you have dopamine beta hydroxylase. And dopamine beta hydroxylase is a little bit present in the cytosol, so it can give noradrenaline. But the main source and presence of dopamine beta hydroxylase is the vesicles of exocytosis, the small synaptic vesicles of exocytosis. And curiously, in noradrenergic neurons, the concentration of dopamine beta hydroxylase is quite elevated. So, noradrenaline could enter the small synaptic vesicle, or dopamine. And then dopamine would be degraded into noradrenaline in the vesicles of exocytosis. So you see there is a peculiarity for noradrenaline, which, by the way, makes a little bit sense, because dopamine is surely in the vesicles of exocytosis, but with dopamine beta hydroxylase, you ensure that its transformation into noradrenaline. So that maybe noradrenergic neurons can release dopamine, but it might be at low concentration. And we have some specific inhibitors. There is one, I think I asked for a synthesis for that, nepicastat. So nepicastat is a drug that blocks selectively dopamine beta hydroxylase. And curiously, it is not very, I think it is underrated. Its use is underrated by both clinic and preclinical studies. I'm not selling it, so I'm not doing I'm not doing some publicity for this molecule, but curious. It looks like it is good, but I don't know, people are not using it. So, last comment, except for noradrenaline, which can be produced inside the vesicle, for the other monoamines, we do have a problem. because the monoamine is in the cytosol, not in the vesicle of exocytosis. So the storage is a fundamental step, as we saw also for glutamate. And the storage here is performed using a specific transporter, which is a vesicular monoamine transporter, VMAT. We have two VMAT. VMAT1, which is located in the adrenal gland, just above the kidney. And we have VMAT2, which is expressed in the brain and spinal cord. So I will more speak about VMAT2, but you have the composition of amino acid of VMAT1 and VMAT2 in the table, and you can see that it is quite similar. The location of VMAT1 is non-neuronal, while the location of VMAT2 is the synaptic vesicles. And it transports monoamines, I mean dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, and histamine. Yes, I think, and adrenaline, I mean for VMAT1. So, this is an active transport. It needs a gradient of pH. So the gradient of pH is ensured, is present thanks to a specific pump that uses ATP and transform ATP into ADP plus phosphate. And this pump allows for the concentration of H plus inside the vesicle of exocytosis. So inside the vesicle of exocytosis, the pH is around 5.4 or something like that. This is quite low pH, so high concentration of H plus, compared to the cytosol, which is something like 7.2.4. And this is, based on that, this is a driving force, and a driving force allowing to take one amino acid, no, not one amino acid, one monoamine from the cytosol to the internal part of the vesicles. And it needs 2 protons versus 1 cytosolic monoamine. Of course, it needs a lot of energy to maintain the gradient, otherwise you cannot put at so high concentration the monoamines from the cytosol, where they are not very highly concentrated, to the vesicle where they are very concentrated. Something like, I don't know, 50 millimolar, 100 millimolar, 500 millimolar. So if you give more precursor, you will have more synthesis and you will have more concentration, higher concentration inside vesicles. So they can concentrate the monoamines inside vesicles, but it needs clearly energy. On the drawing, here, so the small vesicles, you can look at the vesicle in yellow. So first, I recall that you have a pump allowing for the concentration of H plus inside the vesicle. Then, against 2 protons, you have the neurotransmitter, the monoamine, which can enter the vesicle of exocytosis. And if, anyway, these are amines, and especially for dopamine and noradrenaline, these are dangerous amines because they could auto-oxidize. So the auto-oxidation can occur everywhere, so it's better for the cell to place dopamine, noradrenaline, and to some extent serotonin in safe compartment, I mean a compartment where the pH is low, acidic. And they found stability with low pH. So, do we have a specific molecules that impair the transport through the vesicular monoamine transporter? And the answer is yes, and it has been the object of Arvid Carlsson, and participate probably for him to get the Nobel Prize in 2000. He did a lot of experiments using reserpine, which deplete the terminal field of monoaminergic system, simply because it blocks the transport of monoamines from the cytosol to the vesicle of exocytosis. So you can imagine having exocytosis, but the vesicles in the presence of reserpine are empty. So nothing is released, and you can generate maybe in 2 hours akinesia, sort of catalepsy. So it is like a little bit like Parkinson's disease, except that no, you have also reduction of the tone of serotonin and noradrenaline, of course, because you block also their entry in vesicle of exocytosis. Reserpine is not used in any treatment in humans. We have another drug which is binding on the vesicular monoamine transporter. This is called tetrabenazine. And tetrabenazine is a little bit used in the treatment of Huntington disease, which is another neurodegenerative disease characterized by lesion of striatal cells and cortical cells. So it is a little bit used. I'm not sure it is really efficacious, so the clinical data are not that clear, and I don't know. This is weird because in Huntington disease we have also destruction of monoamine cells. No, not monoamines, but essentially dopamine terminals. So I don't really understand the physiopathological basis, the pathophysiological basis of using tetrabenazine. Anyway, in some cases, physicians are giving tetrabenazine. So here I have an example of the effect of reserpine on tissue levels of noradrenaline and dopamine. So I will, okay, this is just to show you that you can expect also different effects in periphery and brain. In periphery, so these are the percentage of control of the amine expressed in probably in nanogram per gram, in microgram per gram of tissue. So you have dopamine in heart, salivary gland, noradrenaline in heart or salivary gland. And here this is noradrenaline plus adrenaline, but usually this is noradrenaline, the main contributor, and dopamine. So each time you have a point, it means that you have a group of animals. So a group of animals has been killed 1 hour after reserpine, 4 hours after, 24 hours, 48, and 96. And in the brain, 2, 4, 6, 8 hours, 24 hours after reserpine administration. And you can see a dramatic decrease in noradrenaline in periphery, while you have also the dramatic decrease of dopamine, but dopamine is going back sooner compared to noradrenaline. And curiously, in the brain, noradrenaline is quite protected compared to dopamine. I mean, they did not see effect, but it goes toward 60%, so be careful. So I switch to the release. So as you know, the release, part of the release is classical, I mean vesicular and calcium dependent, and part of the release is also non-exocytotic, which means non-vesicular and calcium independent. So the exocytotic release is a calcium dependent process involving also potassium, so from Katz in 1950. And it is dependent, I mean part of it, not all part, but part of it, is dependent on the electrical activity of neurons, which gives that if you block the action potential, you dramatically reduce, for some systems, the entry of calcium, and the consequence is you dramatically reduce the quantity released. So here's recycling in terminals of the vesicle of exocytosis. And I will skip this because I think you know that with docking, the exocytosis, and then the endocytosis with clathrin-coated vesicles, and then you fill again the vesicles. So I will skip this. Now, what I would like for you to understand is the study of neurotransmitter release. How can we study the neurotransmitter release? So we can do ex vivo measurement. As I showed you, you punch brain regions and try to measure tissue content of dopamine, metabolites, to do ratio of the metabolites on dopamine. But in any case, it will be extremely indirect. And sometimes everything increases, and when you are looking at the extracellular levels, they decrease. So it is extremely indirect, and this is difficult to extrapolate ex vivo data to extracellular levels of monoamines. After that, you can do in vitro experiment where you have the brain extraction, then you choose to cut in slices, can be 1 millimeter thickness, for instance, or to cut in slides, weak centrifugation, and then you obtain the terminals of the fibers. And the terminals, for instance, of dopaminergic neurons. So you don't have the cell body, you have just the terminals. Then the slice or the synaptosome are superfused with a medium that was long time ago, but still, I mean, I'm trying to measure sometimes in slices endogenous compounds. This is not easy. So what was easy was to give directly the radiolabeled compound of interest, for instance, radiolabeled dopamine. So you are waiting, and dopamine is entering cells, a lot of cells, by the way. And then you place your slice in a medium that does not contain the radiolabeled compound. Okay? So first, with radiolabeled compound for, I don't know, 30 minutes or 1 hour, then the radiolabeled compound enters the cell, and second, you remove the radiolabeled compound, you put it in a medium that does not contain the radiolabeled compound, and normally, what is the radioactivity that you can have comes from cells. So this is a sort of way to measure the release. The same for synaptosome. And there is another strategy, which is to use the metabolic precursor, radiolabeled, so that at the end you can study the neosynthesized production on dopamine function, or serotonin or noradrenaline. Now I switch to the other slide called the study of neurotransmitter release in vitro and in vivo, because you can use them, I mean amperometry, also intracerebral microdialysis. You can use them in vitro, but it is definitely dedicated to in vivo studies. Amperometry, this is the implantation of carbon-coated electrode which directly oxidized the compound of interest in the tissue. So noradrenaline, dopamine, their metabolite. The temporal resolution is very good, so 100 milliseconds, eventually less. And the spatial resolution is not bad. The tip of the electrode, this is 15 micrometer diameter, and the length is 500 micrometers. So, what is the problem with amperometry? There is a big one. There is a big one because the concentration of neurotransmitter in the extracellular space are ridiculous. So, no, I was thinking about something. Do you have the elements to understand this? So imagine, so the concentration are low compared to uric acid, to, I don't know, vitamin C, or compared to the metabolite of dopamine, DOPAC, etc., etc. So in the extracellular space, you have a lot of molecules that are present with higher concentration, and a lot of molecules that can be also oxidized at the potential needed to oxidize dopamine or noradrenaline. So it means that when you are oxidizing dopamine, etc., you see current, but you don't know from where comes this current. For instance, I go back in the beginning. I showed you this. So look at the chromatogram. So here this is high pressure liquid chromatography. So the chromatography is a technique that allows for the separation of the compounds. And using chromatography, you can submit the different compounds to an electrochemical oxidizing cell. So you produce electrons, but the peaks are differentiated because they don't get out at the same time. And this is comfortable because here at some, I don't know, in 4 minutes, you have the peak of noradrenaline. So you can say this is noradrenaline. But imagine in the same situation, you don't have separation, you have everything in the same peak. And this is the case with amperometry. With amperometry, you put your carbon-coated electrode directly in the tissue. So that we, amperometry or voltammetry, what they do fast cycling voltammetry. So they change rapidly the potential to oxidize molecule, because each molecule have its own little tiny different and preferable potential of oxidation. So using a fast cycling voltammetry, changing fastly the potential, they can dissociate via the potential, but not directly, the different constituents, and they have to do Fourier transform to appreciate the quantity of dopamine or noradrenaline. So some people are also studying serotonin. The problem with serotonin is that the concentrations are quite low in the extracellular space. Similar for dopamine in a lot of brain regions. So with voltammetry, this is very good temporal resolution compared to what is coming up, and the temporal, so the good spatial resolution and the good temporal resolution. But it is complicated because you need mathematical treatment of the data. The second technique is intracerebral microdialysis. So it consists to implant a probe in the tissue and to collect by gradient of concentration the molecules in the extracellular space. So the molecules like dopamine or noradrenaline by gradient of concentration will cross a semi-permeable membrane. And then what are you collecting? You are collecting a liquid. And then you analyze the liquid and you are using a technique depending on what neurotransmitter you are interested by. The problem is that the temporal resolution is quite bad, and the spatial resolution is also bad. But, so you will tell me why to use intracerebral microdialysis. Because you don't have the mathematical treatment to do. You can measure also with higher sensitivity in brain region where you cannot go with voltammetry. And voltammetry, so there is another problem. Voltammetry, you need to have a compound that is oxidized, which is the case of dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline for neurotransmitters, and that's it. While with intracerebral microdialysis, you can also look at other compounds like peptides, like, I don't know, ATP, like glutamate, GABA, etc., etc. So, somehow it's better to use intracerebral microdialysis. So here, on this slide, you have the composition of the cannula they sell us. So you have different firms that are selling those probes, and those probes are equipped with glass fiber here, a small one, which is something like 70 micrometer space. Here. just here. And then this is sufficient for perfusing a liquid, which is the artificial cerebrospinal fluid. Then, through this glass fiber, the liquid comes here where you have holes. So the liquids do not have other possibilities than to get out. It is constantly pushed. So it gets out and then go back along the semi-permeable membrane, and here along the semi-permeable membrane, molecules from the extracellular space comes into this liquid by gradient of concentration. Thereafter, you collect your sample at period of time that you have determined a priori. So it can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes. For peptides, you need a lot of material, so some people are doing 30 minutes. So the resolution, the temporal resolution is quite bad. Now pay a look at what they are selling us. So there is a steel shaft. The steel shaft would correspond to the yellow part here, and which is here, above the membrane. And you can see that the membrane here can be from 1 to 4 millimeter length. So this is huge. And the diameter of the membrane length is something like 250 micrometers, but you have also some cannula with 500 micrometers. So can you imagine that terminals is less than 0.2 or 0.5 micrometer? So when you insert this, you are destroying cells and terminals. And it needs time to reach a new steady state. So I have an example here of the procedure. So you have a rat brain, and we are interested to put cannulas in the striatum and the nucleus accumbens, which are the target of the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area dopaminergic neurons. So by surgical stereotaxy, you place the active membrane, so where you have the membrane, inside the structure of interest. Then, once it is done, you perfuse the cannula with artificial cerebrospinal fluid, and here the histological images are just here to tell you that when you insert cannulas, you don't know exactly where they are. Of course, you have the brain and you cannot look at what you are doing. So, even if we use stereotaxic apparatus and stereotaxic atlas, informing on the way we should use the coordinates, you are never sure. So at the end of the experiment, you have to kill the animals and to verify that your membrane was correctly implanted in the region of interest. So, for instance, for the nucleus accumbens, here you have the track left by the membrane, and of course something else. Here, and here for the striatum. You see the trace left by the cannula in the striatum. Then, so the cannula, the probes are perfused. You collect dialysate depending on, I don't know, the time or the perfusion speed. So you have a lot of factors that you need to study before, and once you choose, you stay with the same features. And then, once you have your dialysate, you can virtually use all systems depending on the molecule you are interested in. If you are interested in monoamines, you could use electrochemical detection, which is probably the best method. Or if you are rich, the other best method is spectrometry of mass spectrometry. You can use fluorescence, you can use, I don't know, UV, you can use a lot of things, but in fact, at the end, people are using mass spectrometry because they are rich, electrochemical detection because they are less rich. This is my case, and fluorescence detection. And be aware that they can use also some sort of ELISA plates or something like that. The problem is that it is too expensive. So, yes, okay. So here with electrochemical detection, you can follow, for instance, dopamine here, the DA, and in extracellular space, dopamine is 200 in the striatum, 200 times less concentrated compared to DOPAC. And if the peak looks like it is the same size, this is because the peak is multiplied by 200 times. So the normal line that you see, there is something weird occurring at the level of dopamine. This is simply because we magnify the current at the time of dopamine so that we can see here this is something like 40 to 50 femtomoles of dopamine. But you need a lot of sensitivity to perform, to measure neurotransmitters in extracellular space. So you can do microdialysis and also amperometry in freely moving animals. And here the rat is looking at you, verifying that you are taking good notes. So, without killing, the animal can be placed in a cage of activity, so equipped with different beam and cell beam, etc., to count in the objective way the deambulation of the animals, vertical and horizontal locomotor activity, and you can correlate the behavior with the simultaneous measurement of the neurotransmitter. I mean, simultaneous, no, during period of 15 minutes or 20 minutes. This is not a good correlation, you see. So, the difficulty,
yeah.
Yes.
Did we perfuse the both structures at the same time?
We can. Yes, here there is only one, in that case, in this example, there was only one structure. And if you look and do magnification on here, on the head, above the head of the animal, here, you can see that there is the entry and the output, entry-output, and these are connectors. So, if you have one cannula, you have already two connectors, the entry and the output. So, if you have two cannulas, you have two entry and two output. In addition, if it works, this is because you have a liquid swivel, which on its own costs 1,000 euros. And you have one swivel for one cannula. So it means that if you have two cannulas, you need two swivels. And it becomes really, really tricky. So I have seen some people doing with two cannula, performing with two cannula in freely moving animals, but what I have seen also is that they did a couple of publications with this and they stopped because this is too painful. Already one cannula, this is not easy, but two cannulas, this is stupid, I think, because you lose a lot of data, you see?
Thank you.
So, you're welcome. So, all the tubes need to reach the syringe located at the level of the pump, and all the tubes have to go and to follow the liquid swivel here and then go here along this tube. So the good tubes are inside this big tube, and the reason why there is a big tube is that it allows to follow the movement of the animal. So if the animal is rotating, it is sufficiently strong to make the liquid swivel to rotate as well. So it follows the movement of the animals. So you will tell me why an animal will rotate. It can rotate. And if you are doing the animal model of Parkinson's disease, yes, it can rotate a lot, till 500 turns in 1 hour. So it can rotate a lot. And this kind of systems allows for following the rotation of the animals, the movement of the animals. And here you have also an arm which follows the vertical movement of the animal. So, you can do something with those animals. And you can do also microdialysis or amperometry in anesthetized animals. So here you see a little bit better the pump with syringe. Then it is connected, the tubes are connected to something, a relay, and then the tubes are directly going in the cannula, and you can see the cannula here in yellow, placed above the brain of the rat. And then we are collecting in a collector, in a fraction collector. So this is a very, very old picture because this stupid fraction collector was oxidizing dopamine. So after 3 days, we saw that we did not have signal in our chromatographic analysis, so we threw away this stupid collector, this stupid fraction collector, and then we directly collect in a tube. Nowadays, I'm directly collecting also directly in a tube. And, of course, I'm changing the tubes. But at least I have dopamine. So it depends on what you are interested in and the way you are measuring it. So what are we perfusing? We are perfusing the artificial cerebrospinal fluid, and we have to agree of what is this artificial cerebrospinal fluid, so ACSF. So it is a phosphate buffer. You have some firm who are selling the ACSF without buffer. I think this is a mistake. It should be a buffer even if it is a low buffer. I mean, the phosphate is not really concentrated, something like 2 millimolar compared to the, 100 millimolar of the PBS. But here it has to be a little bit concentrated, so to buffer the ACSF. Then it is supposed to mimic the ion concentration of ions in the extracellular space, because the ACSF is supposed to mimic the extracellular space. So you have a high concentration of sodium, close to 150 millimolar, low concentration of potassium, low concentration of magnesium, 1.2 millimolar of calcium, and to make the electron neutrality, the more than 150 millimolar of chloride ions. So you can prepare this, check your signal with this kind of ACSF. Don't forget that we can also dilute pharmacological drugs directly in the ACSF, so that you infuse, using the microdialysis probe, you infuse drugs. And you will see that with tetrodotoxin. So,